Hello, hello, and welcome to the Japan Zoomina at UC San Diego. Today is April 19th, 2022, at least in California it is. It's April 20th in Japan, and today we're discussing whether or not Japan is ready for war, Putin's invasion, and the Taiwan Contingency. Today's event is co-sponsored by the 21st Century China Center and the Korea Pacific Program at UC San Diego. And our guest, as I will introduce shortly, is Dr. Sheila Smith from the Council on Foreign Relations. But while you are still all finding your Zoom seats, let me tell you a little bit about our Japan Zoomina here at UC San Diego. I'm Ulrike Schede, professor of Japanese business here at UC San Diego, and I'm also the director of JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology, which is our Japan Center. You can find out more about our School of Global Policy and Strategy at gps.ucsd.edu. We offer various degree programs, and if they're of interest, you can find all of that on our website. And then our Japan Center is at jfit.ucsd.edu. If you go there, you can find a bunch of tabs, including one called News and Media, where you can sign up for our JFIT San Diego Japan Newsflash, and the Japan Zoominars, where you can sign up for upcoming events, as well as watching our past recordings. And yes, our Zoominars are recorded. So if you go to jfit.ucsd.edu/Zoominar, you'll find our JZ Gallery. The JZ Gallery looks like this. It's organized by categories. And if you click, for instance, business or politics, you'll find past events. Some of them are cross-listed. All right, so today, of course, we're doing Japan, but just to let you know, on May 3rd, we'll have Suzukan, former vice minister of the Ministry of Education et al., and he'll talk about Japan's education system, followed by Laura Miller, who will talk about women in Japan, and David Wagner on crisis management. If you want to follow us, you can do this either by following me on the various LinkedIn and Twitter things, or sign up for our newsflash and email announcements. All right, so today we have Dr. Sheila Smith here. I'll introduce her in a moment, but I would be amiss if I didn't show you what her website looks like. And I found this in preparation for today's event, and I wanted to let you know that she is exceedingly prolific. And if you go to her website, you can read all kinds of interesting things. And then there's, in addition to that, the blog. I'll talk about that in a moment, but I really recommend that you look her up. Sheila Smith, Council on Foreign Relations, will get you right to this great page. So let me stop this and introduce her. Here she is. Hello, Sheila. Welcome to the Japan Zoomina.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
So I have to look down and read this because there's so much to your CV. I would otherwise make a mistake. So let me see whether I can do this. So Sheila Smith is the John E. Merrill Senior Fellow for Asia Pacific Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She holds a BA and a PhD in political science from Columbia University, and is widely considered one of the leading experts on Japan's military strategies in the United States. She works on Japanese politics, Japanese foreign policies, and is known for her work on the Japanese military in particular and security policies. She's the author of Japan Rearmed, which she published in 2019. There's also the interestingly titled Intimate Rivals: Japanese Domestic Politics and a Rising China. You know, I was looking at this and I thought, you're writing the foreign policy versions of my books, because I have like the Japanese business in the light of rising China. And so there's also Japan's New Politics and the US-Japan Alliance, and many more. She's also an expert on Japan's constitutional change, which is something we will talk about today. There's the blog, Asia Unbound, which is the CFR blog, and she's been at CFR, I believe she get this right, since 2007, and before that she was at the East-West Center, which I believe is in Hawaii, nice spots, and a visiting scholar at various universities, including Keio, the University of Tokyo, and the University of the Ryukyus, which will put you right in the middle of some interesting geography. She's an advisor to the Mansfield Foundation and the chair of the Japan-US Friendship Commission and CALCON. She's also on the editorial board of the Journal of Asian Affairs and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, which is our rival, but that's okay. Welcome, Sheila. I hope I got this right.
That was more than everybody needed to know, but thank you.
Okay, great. So we'll have a conversation today, and audience, the way we're structuring this is that I'll ask Sheila a few questions, but then if you would like me to include your thoughts and questions into our conversations, please feel free to write them into the Q&A, and I will monitor the Q&A and see whether I can make sure that we have you heard as we talk about our topic today. So let's start with the domestic issues, Sheila, because before we go into the Taiwan and Ukraine and all of that, but so Japan has a new prime minister, Kishida, and last time when you wrote the book, it was Abe still, right? So how is Japan's military planning post Abe? Are there changes in defense spending, maybe, or what's going on in Japan today?
Well, thank you for having me. And this is a great time to talk about these issues. There's a lot going on this year in Japanese military planning and thinking about their strategy. So let me try to set your audience up a little bit for what's coming later this year. So we often think that a lot of the changes in Japanese security policy are a result of political leaders such as Abe, who really during his almost 8 years in office, instituted a lot of security reforms. So new laws on secrecy, new laws on counterterrorism, reinterpreting Article 9 of the Constitution to allow for collective self-defense, moving the needle somewhat on defense spending. So we think about him as a fairly hawkish leader and somebody who accomplished a lot. But Kishida is facing, I think, two of the most critical issues that Japan is going to confront in a decade or more. And those are first, the desire of his party to really push the envelope on defense spending. In fact, as you know, last year during the LDP leadership race, the LDP formally adopted the aspiration of matching the NATO target of 2% of GDP of national defense spending. And that was in their campaign platform when they went to the polls in the lower house election. The second thing, and this has been on the table for quite some time, is this question of should Japan acquire offensive capability? As you know, its neighbors all around it in Northeast Asia have ballistic missiles. Japan is the only country in that neighborhood that does not maintain a ballistic missile capability. And so that's really what we're talking about, either ballistic missiles or cruise missiles or some kind of long-range strike capability that will make folks in Pyongyang or in Beijing think twice about threatening Japan. So you've got these two issues, both a massive aspirational increase in defense spending and this question of offensive capability, that they're coming up on Kishida's watch. And this is what we're going to see later this year, some decision-making on the national policy front.
So where's the electorate on this? I mean, it's or the Japanese in general. I mean, there's this impression that we have from abroad that there's a constitution and there's all this noise about should we change Article 9. Where do the voters stand, or the public in general, whether they vote or not?
So on the question of defense spending, and should we spend more on defense? Should we do more about defense? You've watched, the major media opinion polling on this, whether it's Yomiuri or Asahi, has largely shown increased concern by the Japanese public about the deterioration of Japan's neighborhood. That doesn't mean that they embrace all of the ideas that either Prime Minister Abe or today the Prime Minister Kishida will be putting forward. But you do see concern on the part of the Japanese public, and that you can see pretty obviously in public opinion polling. But when it comes to specifics, like this offensive strike capability, the government has yet to actually formally put it on the agenda. It's been hovering around in study groups in Benkyokai in the LDP, and Benkyokai or study groups in the MOD. So it's not quite on the table for people to react to yet. But I think on that issue, you're going to get quite an interesting conversation in Japan about whether or not this violates the Constitution. And you can imagine, as most of us who know Japan well, you'll have people who will think it does, that Japan shouldn't have that kind of capability. But you'll see the government present this as largely a defensive measure in order to deter aggression against Japan.
Yeah, so I mean, we'll probably come to this point again as we look at the Ukraine in just a moment, the situation there. But so what are Japan's top 3 military concerns today?
So the longest one and the most immediate one, of course, has been the acquisition of a nuclear capability by North Korea. And that's the Cold War flashpoint. The Korean Peninsula has always been the focal point for Japanese thinking about its defense planning, even during the Cold War, and the way in which the alliance with the United States has operated to imagine a scenario in which the United States and Japan would have to operate jointly to defend Japan. So North Korea looms large, and the nuclear piece, of course, is very important because that could decouple in some ways, theoretically, Japan from the United States. So it's a real test of extended deterrence, the nuclear umbrella that the United States extends to Japan. But there's also the missile threat. And I don't know if you remember in 2017, but North Korea, this was the first year of the Trump administration. Those of us in Washington were cowering down, listening to the rhetoric about fire and fury. But what was going on there was a very sophisticated series of tests by Pyongyang of their missile capability, short, medium, and long range capabilities. So Japan worries about that, obviously, because the missile capability then threatens Japan directly. The larger sort of long-term challenge for Japan, of course, is the rise of China. And China's increasingly sophisticated naval maritime capability, maritime and air capability, which has really extended the Chinese control over the East China Sea and is increasingly extending their control over the South China Sea. So this is obviously something that Japan worries about. And the Chinese behavior in the region is beginning to suggest that the Chinese are not necessarily wanting to go to war. We don't have to elevate it to that level of threat, but that they're quite willing to use their maritime capability to assert their interests across the region in ways that Japan and others are not very comfortable with.
Is there a red line? I mean, so is there a red line where Japan would be triggered to do something? I mean, so currently we're thinking all is good, all is well, right? But what would actually change this sort of current situation or these concerns?
So the obvious, Japan doesn't speak in terms of red lines. So there is, I wrote this in my book, there is no conversation that the Japanese have that say, if you do this, we will respond, right? But the obvious place that they would respond is if there was aggression against Japanese territory. And that by extension would mean, for example, the Senkaku Islands, or it would mean Japanese shipping, or it would mean Japanese capabilities, military capabilities forward deployed, right? And so that's very proximate to Japanese territory and territorial waters. Beyond that, I think you have a fairly vague picture of when and how the Japanese would be willing to respond when you get away from the physical territory of Japan. And so I don't know if you remember, it was 7-8 years ago, there was the terrorist case in Libya, right, where there was Japanese were taken hostage. There was some discussion inside the LDP about Japan should have special operations forces capable of responding and rescuing hostages, but they have not moved in that direction. In other words, to use force on behalf of Japanese citizens abroad is not something that I think people feel is within the constitutional constraint.
Well, but now I'm sure the audience is wondering how we came up with the title for this event, right? Is Japan ready for war? So what do we actually know about the state of the Japanese military? How big is it? How good is it? How rearmed is it? So can you tell us a little bit more about
the Japanese military is the largest service is the ground self-defense force. And that, if you include reserves, we were talking about this before we came on, it's probably somewhere around 120,000, but with reserves, you could get up to another couple of 20,000 more if you included the full complement. The air and maritime wings are much, much smaller, 20 to 30,000 each, depending on which year you're looking at, right? Because it ebbs and flows like most militaries. They're not always at full complement. And with Japan's aging society, this is like every other aspect of Japanese society, there's demographic challenges for the SDF in recruiting to full complement. But largely, this is a military that is very sophisticated in terms of hardware. So, the history of the Japanese Navy is quite renowned across the globe. So shipbuilding, their naval capability and doctrine is very well known and very highly regarded. I would say it's the premier Navy of Asia, including compared to our 7th Fleet. I think they're on par with the American 7th Fleet in terms of their skill set and their capability to operate. Their Air Force is trained by the United States in the post-war. It's a separate service for the first time in the post-war period, very sophisticated. They've been on the front line of the Cold War, dealing with the Soviet MiGs up in the north, right? So they're fairly sophisticated, and they're about to become F-35 pilots. So that's the best of the technology that the United States produces. So the quite sophisticated maritime and air capabilities. The ground self-defense force has largely been at home, and so it's harder to judge. This is the force that, of course, sometimes goes abroad in PKO, peacekeeping operations with the United Nations. They're logistically very savvy. They've worked very, very hard at disaster relief and humanitarian assistance missions, both at home and abroad. So they're very well respected. But the thing to remember is, we've never seen them fight because Japan has never been in a war. And it's hard to judge the capability of a military until you see them, as we all know as we're watching the Russians at the moment in Ukraine, the Ukrainians in Ukraine. The real measure of the expertise of a military is actually in combat. And when you see them, that the judgments then come differently. So we don't know, because Japan has never been in combat in the post-war period.
So I always think that language is interesting in these kind of discussions. So I remember that in the old days, we had to be very careful that we would refer to the self-defense forces, and the land and the sea. And I had a student in my class the other day who was talking about the Japanese Navy.
Yes. Yeah.
I said, can I say that? He said, sure, we're the Navy, right? And we're the Army. And so there are changes happening in Japan, though, right?
Generationally, you've got a younger group of leaders now who are quite comfortable thinking of themselves as a military. They understand the politics of the named self-defense force, so they don't assert their military capability. But they train and they think operationally. They develop their own doctrines. They debate with Americans and other national militaries like the Australians. So this is a younger group who are more savvy and more internationally engaged, and they don't have the same hesitation that the generation before them had.
So this part of the conversation is already triggering a lot of questions. So let me, so Joe is interested. By the way, everybody, this is recorded, so I will refer to you only by your first name to ensure your privacy. Joe wonders about Space Force capability, and Byron is interested in, while you might say that each branch is capable, what's their level of ability to fight in an integrated military campaign?
So on the Space Force question, a couple of years ago, the United States was really anxious to have its allies play a larger role in space. And this is as we were developing our own Space Force with its independent command. And, the general who is the first head of the Space Force in the United States, in fact, was one of the commanders in Operation Tomodachi in 2011, and is very well known and highly respected among the Japanese Air Force leaders. So the Japanese Air Force is where you'll find their Space Force. They don't have an independent Space Force, but remember, Ulrike, that only early in the Abe administration in about 2013, I believe, it could be 2014, the Abe cabinet allowed Japanese space policy to become also a military policy. And so you started to see that in the early years of the second Abe tenure as prime minister. And in that, then the conversation with the United States developed, and the Japanese now have a small but engaged Space Force that operates quite closely with ours.
And so on this question on, okay, so we have these branches and they're training hard and they have great equipment. Maybe you already answered this question, but Byron was asking regardless. What do you think about an integrated military campaign?
So when we talk about militaries, we talk about jointness. We talk about different branches working jointly with other branches. And this is a little bit of an Achilles heel. It is not unlike the kind of stovepipes of the Japanese bureaucracy. Integrated operations are not what Japanese typically institutions are good at. But you're starting to see, sorry, it's probably oversimplification, but it's true. And so now you're getting a real emphasis. So if you look back at the defense plan of 9 years ago now, developing joint capability structures, developing not necessarily a command, but an operational center that focused on jointness was a very instrumental piece of moving the needle somewhat forward. So now you have, for example, in the Southwestern strategy. So that is Kyushu down through the Ryukyu Islands, right? This is important for dealing with China. The Southwestern strategy was largely developed by the Ground Self-Defense Force, the Army. And if you think about that, that's a little crazy because it's all islands, right? But down in Kyushu, the command down in Kyushu at the time was led by a general who really was pushing the jointness and really worked hard to pull in maritime and air units and then to operate and exercise in the exercises they call exercises throughout the Ryukyu and Bonin Islands. So they're working the problem at that level, the exercise command level, mission specific, but they're also working it at this higher level of identifying joint operations that will be absolutely instrumental for the defense of Japan, and then pulling together the operational units that would be necessary to work those missions as well. So you're seeing overlap a little bit. The ballistic missile defense mission, largely Air Force, is pulling in the ground self-defense forces, and of course the maritime self-defense forces on sea-based ballistic missile systems. So as these missions develop, and as the technology requires it, the jointness then will come naturally. But they're pushing hard on this, I think, to try to correct the problem.
So we're getting now into the larger geopolitics, right? And let's maybe start with the Ukraine war, and before we kind of come back to what that all means for Asia. So what is the Asian view of the Ukraine war, and specifically, Jada wonders how might Russia's invasion impact the policy debates about Japan's national security strategy and the doctrine, and maybe even is it enough to give this constitutional change, push it forward?
Yeah. So let me just address the constitutional piece first, because I can move that over. So the thing for everybody to remember is Japan has developed one of the most sophisticated militaries in Asia. It spends among the top 10 in the world on it invests among the top 10 in its military capabilities, and it hasn't touched the Constitution. So it has done all this without any revision, any desire for revision, right? And so I think it's important for your audience to understand that constitutional revision in and of itself has a meaning for Japan's declaratory policy, i.e. Japan's communicating intentions abroad, in addition to fulfilling the promise of the Japanese people will never resort to the use of force, right? And so we should remember that piece. But in terms of actual change in operational doctrine, Constitution hasn't changed, but Japan has changed a lot. On the Ukraine war, I think there's been a number of things that are interesting, and I'll just throw them out without any, great organizational structure here. But first of all, Prime Minister Kishida was very quick to frame this not as a European conflict, but as a conflict that challenged international global norms, the rule of law, the right of self-determination, the respect for sovereignty. So very quickly, the prime minister took the lead in framing this as this is a global problem. It is our problem, right? And the second piece that I think is really interesting here is Japan worked hand in hand with the G7 in a way it didn't in 2014 when the annexation of Crimea happened. But there is a very early decision made by the Kishida Cabinet that they would pace their response according to the G7 coordinated ambitions of economic sanctions, right? Both restrictions, if necessary, on energy and other kinds of steps that would keep them in pace and on focus, right, with the G7. So not all of it has gone completely smoothly because, of course, Japan doesn't have the same kind of sanctions laws, doesn't have the same kind of infrastructure levers to be able to do some of these things quickly. But I've been impressed with how comprehensive they have been in trying to not only punish Russia, but also aid Ukraine. And that a lot of that part of the assistance to Ukraine is also very, very new. So I think it's an interesting moment for Japan to be aligning itself so conspicuously with Europe and the United States in defense of the norms of the post-war period. And when the UN can't do that job, you know, the G7 now is the vehicle that allows Japan to participate at the forefront of the Western sanctions. The one piece I'll say on the aid to Ukraine that was surprising to me is without any kerfuffle, political, you know, tension between opposition and LDP, you know, public opposition, they sent self-defense force gear to Ukraine. And granted, it's not lethal forces, it's not missiles and things like that for combat, but nonetheless, they sent self-defense force material to a combat zone to aid one side of the war. Never has that happened before. In fact, most of the Ministry of Defense officials that I know were shocked that it happened so quickly and without any question about whether this was constitutional or not, right? Because it certainly was not the interpretation the government had given about their ability to help in the past. Anything that had to do with combat zone, the Japanese were a no-touch kind of response, but they haven't. They have just poured it on humanitarian aid, loans, you know, material support, moving refugees, giving Poland assistance, Moldavia assistance, sanctioning, you know, not only Putin, right, but Belarus. So they have been really quite in the thick of things, and in a way that I didn't think I would have. If I had to predict this, I would have said Japan wouldn't have been able to keep pace like that.
And why is that?
I think this is an investment in the future. Honestly, I think that Japan and Kishida, I think, is quite smart here because he sees this, and I think he's right, as the rest of the West looks at this, that this is not just about Russia and Ukraine. This is really about the post-war structure of international politics where we respect the sovereignty of other nations. You know, conquest and invasion is not something that we think of as, you know, something that we approve of anymore, right? Especially in the heart of Europe. But I think for Kishida, he sees that if this is going to be, you know, he needs to be there, Japan needs to be there, so that if something happens in Asia, if China uses force in Asia in the same way, then the Europeans and the Americans will also see this not as a regional problem, but as a challenge to global norms.
Yeah, this is where now we're going back. Although before we go to Taiwan, Elizabeth reminds us, might this have something to do with the Kuriles? Karafto, the Northern Territories?
They, you know, remember in 2014 with Crimea, Abe was in the middle of his attempt to persuade Putin that they could come to a deal on the islands. Abe was trying to encourage his domestic companies to invest more in the Far East so that Putin would be more favorably inclined to making a deal on the islands so they would finally get right to that peace treaty. That, you know, Abe's efforts, for better or worse, they were probably well placed, but they didn't come to fruition. But what they did is they made the decision, and apparently within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it was quite a little bit of a debate in the Kante, in the Prime Minister's office. Kishida was quite straightforward and forthright. In the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they were thinking, what about our Russia relationship? What do we do here? But they cut that they understood that that would be the end of those negotiations, that would be the end of an attempt at negotiated solution to the island dispute. So I think, yeah, they took a deep gulp and they said, all right, this is where our interests lie, and this is the way we're going to go.
So the let's go to Taiwan, because I think that's sort of the elephant in the room. When when this first happened, I remember very clearly. So this would now be what, 4 weeks ago. Somebody just the first thing that I heard was, "Oh my goodness, this is a license to invade." Because people had various reasons that they brought up why this was a license, for a Taiwan invasion. Partially because the U.S. couldn't be in two places at the same time. Partially because, well, if Russia gets away with it, why not? Partially because, everything is out of order anyway, so we might as well. So what's your sense on the Taiwan contingency?
So I think, especially where I live inside the Beltway in Washington, there was a quite, quick equals, Russian invasion of Ukraine equals China invasion of Taiwan, same thing, same scenario, and it's not. There are massive differences. There are not differences, though, that I think would predict a necessarily different outcome, but there are differences that we'll have to sort of filter through and think about more carefully than just saying, it's the same thing, let's, apply the same approach. Obviously the thing that we need to remember is most of the countries of the world don't recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state. Now, I think there's public opinion is changing in many of the European nations. In Australia, there's a recent poll where you see that Australians think of Taiwan as an independent country, even though their government doesn't recognize it as such. So I think there's some dissonance, arising in the democracies in particular on this issue. But the reality is, Ukraine is unquestionably a sovereign state, right? Taiwan, it's a question, right? There's military operational questions. Land wars are different than maritime. Invading an island, taking Taiwan by force is a very different prospect than having the Russian tanks roll across, the eastern plains of Ukraine. So we've got different operational contexts to think about in terms of military action. But then there's the difference in scale of the economy. Russia is the 12th largest economy in the world, and that's largely due to energy, energy sales. China is a considerably larger economy. And so when you start to think about using the same kind of methods to deter or sanction or punish, you're looking at actually systemic economic impact. Trying to do what the West is currently doing vis-a-vis Russia is already hard. It's not necessarily an easy thing to unify all of the Western countries that have been, brought into the sanctions regimes. And it's still, we're debating the energy piece, right? Pretty considerably. But you try to do that with China, and it's massive disruption in all of this. This is your area, but massive supply chain disruption, massive trade disruption. Just look at all the ships. It's on Twitter these days, all the ships sitting off of Shanghai, just because of the lockdown of Shanghai. But you introduce this kind of element of instability in the region, the economic ripple waves are going to be, they're going to be global in nature, and they're going to be destabilizing to every country that tries to engage in some kind of economic sanction of China. So I think there's a scale to the problem, there's a scale to the solution that's quite different than what you're seeing in the current moment. The flip side, again, this is really important, and I think your audience probably knows this better than any, is that you don't have a multinational alliance structure in Asia. You don't have the heft of the EU plus NATO plus the United States plus the G7, right? So you've got Japan, the United States. And when we talk about it, especially when people here in Washington talk about it, they beat the drum of Japan has to do more on Taiwan. Well, they think that Japan and the United States are going to defeat China over Taiwan. And there's a larger frame in the region that we have to think about. But I think, and I just wrote a piece for NBR, and I'll share it with you when it's out. It's out next week. But that means that we have to think about a global strategy for dealing with Taiwan. We can't just zero in on the US-Japan alliance as the mechanism for responding to any kind of crisis that may arise or any kind of escalation in tensions over Taiwan. I think there's the Ukraine scenario makes it very clear that we've got some work to do on the diplomatic front in particular, but also on the economic front to think about the future of Taiwan.
So let's stay with the sanctions for a little bit because we have a few questions on it. Our colleague Christina wonders whether the government has issued any administrative guidance encouraging Japanese firms to withdraw from the Russian market, or if they haven't, Rick, who's an economist, would like to know what actually could be done and whether, so my sense, I mean, so Germany, of course, cannot disentangle itself from Russia on the energy side at all. And we see this great example how that's not going to work. But what is Japan's role there? I mean, is this a lot of singing the song, or are there explicit Japanese measures?
So I don't hear the Japanese government issuing formal guidance. So that just might be my ignorance, but I don't see that as part yet of what has been happening. For the most part, what I see is private consultation. But an example, the Sakhalin 1 and 2, right? The energy projects on Sakhalin. So you've got large companies, Mitsubishi and Mitsui, deeply invested, already invested in that. And of course, remember after the 2011 earthquake, Russia really stepped in to help with LNG exports to Japan, to help Japan when its nuclear power plants were down. So there was an acceleration of investment after the Great East Japan earthquake. Neither of those companies, to my knowledge, have been told by the government that they should get out. Instead, the government has talked to the Biden administration, the Japanese government has consulted with the Biden administration. And of course, as you said, the Europeans went first, right? And the Europeans basically said, we can't stop tomorrow, but we will begin to move away from dependence. So we have a plan to reduce our energy dependence on Russia. And so Japan, in a way, has a little bit of political cover. It has less dependence on Russia than the Europeans, especially the Germans, do. And it too can reduce dependence over time. I think politically that was quite understood by the Biden administration. The other point that the companies made is that the minute Japan pulls out, I don't know if you remember, it was a decade or two ago now, when Japan was really forced to pull out of Iran, right? The oil investment. The Chinese and the Koreans swooped right in, right? I mean, and so Sakhalin in particular, if we come out, the Chinese will be in a flash. So this is another way in which the geopolitical situation is more complex these days. It's not a straightforward kind of calculus here. You have to think also about who would benefit if the Japanese moved away from their energy relationship with Russia. So just so we know, it's about 10 to 11% on LNG. Japan's imports of LNG from Russia, and about 4% of crude oil. So it's nowhere near the levels of Europe. Okay.
So it's interesting that you bring up the economics, because there's this big soul searching going on in Germany right now. Were we misguided to think that globalization could be part of a larger appeasement thing, right? So we create resource dependence. We've always known it's bad, but let's create it because it might actually bring peace and appeasement and all of these wonderful things. Are we learning something very important here at this moment? I mean, will economics ever be, or business relations, shall we say, ever be a stabilizer, or are we just realizing right now that was a time?
Well, I don't know whose realization is coming now as opposed to earlier, but the Japanese, I wrote about this in Intimate Rivals just a little bit, because what you started to see in Intimate Rivals, I mean, in the Japan-China relationship, is very forward-leaning ideas. You pointed out that economic interdependence would bring reconciliation and peace. And that was a path. It was also commercially very viable. I mean, there's also that, right? It's a good idea. But it also has this political impact to it, and especially the Japan-China relationship, right? It was very important. And you started to see by the late 1990s, at least in the government level, a little bit of less enthusiasm for that. If they've got missiles, but the finance minister famously said in Japan, they've got missiles pointed at us. Why should we continue to be giving them aid? So you started to get political calculus moving in here that was a little bit different than the original reconciliation mission. But at the end of the day, the other piece is this question of resilience. And this, again, is your area of expertise, but the supply chain issue is becoming ever more critical. And how do we move to reshoring? Do we move to disentangling? Decoupling is a little extreme, but let's diversify and let's think about critical technologies, semiconductors, right? So you see the Japanese now investing, I think it's something like $400 million over 10 years to get TSMC, the Taiwanese semiconductor company, to build a factory with Sony in Kumamoto. So I think you're starting to see not necessarily a complete decoupling move, but at least a little bit more of an economic security bent to some of the relationships that the both private and public sector Japanese leaders are cooperating on. So batteries, semiconductors, the Europeans are looking at hydrogen as well, right? So Europe, United States, Japan are beginning to identify these critical technologies. It doesn't come out of the Ukraine situation, but it comes out of this situation of looking at China and Chinese behavior and the willingness of China to use economic coercion to get its political aims with specific countries, and being less sanguine, if you will, right, about depending too much on China.
So you mentioned TSMC. Now here, let's go back to Taiwan. We have a lot of questions. So the hypotheticals, the what if, right? The what if scenarios. And there are several in the audience that would like to know, if China were to move into Taiwan, whatever the right vocabulary there is, you can help me there. That's your bailiwick, but you know what I mean. So China invades Taiwan, and hypothetically speaking, two big questions. One is from Aki, who is interested in what that would mean domestically. Would there be domestic actors that restrain active Japanese response? And then there's a whole group of folks who are interested in what that would mean for U.S. Japan. Would Japan and the U.S. kind of move in concert? Can they? How would that work? So can you maybe spin that out a little bit for us?
In a little bit. So I, just so everybody knows, I don't have a classified clearance, and so I don't see the planning that goes on behind this classified wall. But there's a couple of dimensions here. I think most of the people that I know who are China experts, and you may have many of them in your audience as well, find it hard to believe that Beijing would just begin to use force and attack Taiwan, right? The economic loss that we would suffer, Taiwan would suffer, China would also suffer. And we all know that China is deeply integrated with the Taiwanese manufacturing industry, its supply chains, right? So there's a lot of integration there on both sides. So it would kind of blow up for all sides. So the situation in which we can imagine Xi Jinping waking up one morning and saying, okay, PLA, go, it's kind of hard to imagine, right? I think what we're looking at is the potential for increased tension and increased interaction, maybe miscalculation. You always have to think when you've got a lot of militaries sort of in and around each other, and the PLA has been quite visibly demonstrating their qualitative and quantitative desire to pressure Taiwan's defenses, right? Accidents happen more than we would like to think. So a plane goes down, a Chinese pilot is killed, or a Taiwanese ship is sunk, or something happens, right? Then the escalatory dynamic could actually get quite quick. And especially given the tension in the Beijing-Washington relationship at the moment, and this is something the Biden administration in the last several months has been working on actively, which is to reinstate the military hotlines, the crisis management communications protocols, so that if there's an accident or miscalculation, or some pilot or ship captain does something on their own, right, they can pull it back, right? So I think there's risk management is one piece of the puzzle, and that's in the U.S.-Japan alliance. There's what we call the alliance coordination mechanism now that would go into play. So the alliance would also function in that way to stop the escalation of tensions. And that's one place where we have to have a fairly considered effort. The next is, of course, signaling intent. And a lot of what we do when we go on alert and we send, task forces and ships, and is we're basically signaling we're watching and we are not happy and we will respond. So you can get a lot of signaling during peacetime, and we've done it in the Taiwan Straits. You know that in the 50s, we sent aircraft carriers through the Straits. Bill Clinton in 1996 sent an aircraft carrier, but did not go through the straits, went around the straits, right? But the thing about that 1996 example that I think is important for us to remember is there's an election coming in Taiwan. And we are quite comfortable with President Tsai's ability to navigate this complex escalation of tension. But elections, this is a tough time, right? These are moments also when Beijing is quite sensitive to the way in which the Taiwanese understand Beijing's intentions as well. So you could see that kind of electoral political tension then causing more desire by the Chinese to put coercive pressure on Taiwan. I think of the out and out question is, let's just say we've gotten to the point, there's a cyber attack, there's asymmetrical kinds of weakening of Taiwanese, economic capability. Then there's a question of the United States and Japan trying to figure out what they're going to do together. If it's an actual, what the military calls a kinetic exchange, i.e. the shooting, there's actual use of force, then the United States will need bases in Japan. They won't be able to do things off of an aircraft carrier. If it escalates to a major military conflict with China, which is what we mean by a Taiwan contingency. Don't be fooled. It doesn't stay in Taiwan. It is a major war. Then you've got you've got major war setting in which the bases, the forces in Japan, our entire Pacific forces will be engaged, as will the Japanese self-defense forces. And so, it's hard to make the leap from crisis to that level. But if you look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, one of the things that I think we need to explore a lot further in much, much more detail with our Japanese partners is how we understand nuclear coercion during a crisis, and even if force begins to get used, because you've watched Putin basically threaten both horizontal escalation, right, to other European countries, or to the level of chemical or nuclear war. And you've watched the Biden administration say, we are not going to engage because we do not want a nuclear conflict, right? The dynamics that could lead to the use of nuclear weapons with Russia. So this is new. This is the part of the current war that I think, and I'm not sure we're out of the woods, because I think you can see in the United States, I'm sure, in Europe, more assistance to Ukraine, Don't let Ukraine be defeated. We're watching it, right? And so get engaged, get those MiGs from Poland. America should give more assistance, so the public's engagement will get more heated, especially if it looks like Ukraine is going to lose. Right? And we're in this next phase of the war where the Ukrainian forces are going to come under considerable pressure from the Russian forces. So we've not been here before, right? In terms of trying to understand nuclear risk and nuclear coercion. And that, if you transplant that piece over to Japan, United States, Taiwan, and China, that's a pretty frightening prospect.
So I'm getting very uneasy here, and I'm now also thinking that Aki's question may be irrelevant at that point, because yes, so the Komeito might say no, we don't want that, but there might not be any choice at that point.
And the public sentiment, and I think this is one of the things we often think about nuclear deterrence or nuclear risk in terms of, professional communication of capability, right? Our militaries go on DEFCON 4, we go to alert, we signal, we do certain kinds of exercises to signal, right? And so that's a very inside the military, inside the professional way of communicating. And it's usually not that visible to the publics because it's not meant to be, right? It's meant to be visible to our adversary or potential adversary. But when you start to get war, like we are seeing in Ukraine, the publics everywhere are engaged, right? Because we're watching it 24/7 in real time on TV. And that then introduces a political dimension, which is what I put in the piece that we often don't think about. We're very in this like esoteric nuclear kind of dialogue, but when the public see Taiwan in trouble, or, the Japanese in trouble, or, you're going to have a very different political situation to work through. And the prime minister may not be consulting with Komeito and others right? And the
Well, there might
alliance,
not be any time.
there may not be time, and the alliance may not necessarily be on the same, we may not be on the same page. So these are all I don't want to scare people. I just want to say that these are things we've never had to think about before, but we're witnessing today as we watch the Russian invasion of Ukraine in a way that makes me think that the US and Japan needs a little bit more depth to their conversation about the nuclear element.
I mean, certainly the Ukraine war has been a huge wake-up call also for continental Europe.
Yeah.
And Germany, for starters. And then it has changed the entire tone of how Germans think about defense and military spending and so forth. And it does that in the same way in Japan, I suppose.
You have nuclear allies in Europe. So the Brits and the French are nuclear powers, technically speaking, right? None of our allies in Asia are nuclear powers, right? So these are dimensions that not necessarily, there's ways of walking through them and thinking about them out loud, but these are new dimensions. This major power, this era that we're living in raises different kinds of questions about nuclear risk, I think, than we've been either as academics or as practitioners we've been talking about in the past.
So Tomo has a really great question that I also wanted to ask you, speaking about new horizons. Cyber war and the importance of not only information and intelligence, but this whole, what we're seeing in the Ukraine now is that part of this war is fought in cyberspace, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that, and then also how Japan would be, what do we know, if we even know, how Japan might think about that?
So I think cyber is one of the areas, and in preparation for the Tokyo Olympics, Japan massively upgraded its cyber capability, right? It's both government and private sector. So you've got some really great cyber experts in Japan now. The Mihoko Matsubara, I don't know if you know.
She was on a Zoomina just 4 weeks ago. So yeah, she's
amazing, and she's in the private sector. She's one of their best. So there is a human resource capacity being built in Japan to address some of these specific questions. But cyber, we're all vulnerable. The South Koreans get hit by the North Koreans all the time. I don't know if you remember again in 2017, but lots of ATMs in South Korea went down. People couldn't get their money. And, there's different moments where other things were happening in Japan. MHI was attacked, right? Obviously, Sony, the whole world knew about the Sony hack because of the North Korean movie, right? And so we shouldn't assume either that it will be one actor. And I think that's the thing. We get very narrow-minded about the Taiwan scenario. It's all about China. But, we've got another actor up to the north. And now Japan has this third rather uncomfortable relationship with Russia up at the north as well. So I think for Japan, they are probably going to see themselves be much more in the scope of both Russians, North Koreans, and Chinese going forward, just to demonstrate capabilities, to demonstrate to the Japanese what can happen if Japan decides to offer bases to the United States. So cyber can be used in the same way nuclear coercion, cyber coercion is very effective in pointing out vulnerabilities and also trying to dissuade participation in certain cases with the United States. So I think, again, this is an area where the US-Japan relationship is very focused. They're looking at what they call cross-domain warfighting, which is cyber, maritime, and space. So none of these exist all by themselves, right? It is the utilization of multiple domains at the same time by multiple actors in Asia, right? It's a complex problem for the alliance because it's a complex region.
So Jill asked an interesting question, which I think she's wondering, why haven't we been able to stop the war in Ukraine? And you could even get a little bit broader than that and say, why haven't we been able to prevent it from even happening? And that's done, but can we learn something? I mean, so as we are in this moment, is there anything that we can take away from the current ongoings in Ukraine and say, let's not do this in Asia, or let's do that in Asia to sort of, can we be smart about this? Or is this just, is the Ukraine story just a Russia doing whatever Putin wants to do.
Well, that might be the lesson, right? One of the things I think that will be debated, and I don't have an answer to this, but I think it'll be debated for some time, is had we instituted sanctions prior to his invasion, could we have demonstrated the unity of the West early enough to dissuade him from doing it? So that, I think, is a serious question. I don't know that we'll ever come to a clear answer on it, but it will have significant import to how we think about Taiwan, right? The other piece, I think, is, and this is not a question so much, is China. You know, we're going to have to watch carefully to see what and how China absorbs the lessons of the Russian invasion. And I think it's hard to know how any of us, what lessons we learn prior to the end of the war, because how this war is resolved is going to determine what lessons people take away, right? If it's the defeat and disembowelment of Ukraine, all kinds of horrible lessons will be taken, right? If it's Ukraine standing up to pushing out and pushing back on Russia and being victorious, there'll be other lessons to be taken from that. But I think for Asia, as we move over, there's this big independent variable, which is China, and how China actually behaves in the coming months vis-a-vis support for Russia, but also how China digests all kinds of things that they must be watching with great fascination, right? That we're going to have pretty sustained dialogue with Beijing about. And I think this is a place where when we get into the military realm, we often forget that we have diplomacy as one of our primary tools of statecraft. There is diplomacy to be had in abundance here with China about the mutual cost of the use of force across the Taiwan Strait. And so before we jump into it's all about deterrence, which it is, we have to make sure we're ready. But we shouldn't forget the diplomatic conversation and the diplomatic effort that we need to have with China and with others about what would happen if, and what would the costs be, and why we should act in concert to avoid those costs at all. So I think there's a lot to be learned here. I am not a fan of the demonization of Putin. I think he looks like we could demonize him forever, but the reality is we have lost the diplomatic tool in some ways. Now, maybe it would never have worked. Maybe he has been so intent. I think the conclusion being drawn, given his behavior and given the prosecution of the war, is that he is unreachable, right? And I think, there's PhD dissertations to be written about how not to allow leaders to become unreachable, and whether it's in the diplomatic sphere, whether it's domestic as well. So I think there's a lot we can mull over for some time on this.
So this is a fantastic conversation, and I'm watching the clock, and I don't want to rush you into the, normally I ask this question, what are you most worried about? But I think then we end on a very negative note. So let's stop with this, learning, and maybe we can have you back in the future and talk about what we're worried next. Thank you so much, Sheila Smith from the Council on Foreign Relations. This was just an outstanding conversation. And audience, thank you. You've been sticking with us here for a long time. Let me point out to you that we at UCSD also have the 21st Century China Center that discusses many of the issues that we're discussing today on a regular basis. So go to gps.ucsd.edu and look at our calendar. And thanks for sticking with us. And we'll see you again in 2 weeks when we talk about Japan's education system. And Sheila, thank you very much. This was outstanding, really remarkable. It's wonderful to have had you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.